So just a standard reminder, if you look down in the description, we got links to our indexes and um, there, I think there's a link out to our Slack channel and some other stuff. So that's how you tie all this stuff together. So last over the last week or two, people have been talking about taking a Raspberry Pi and trying to power it from uh, say a battery on your vehicle, as opposed to getting the official wall wart and plugging it into the AC in your house and powering it that way. And there was various discussion on Slack about that. And um, at one point there was discussion, should you use the power it through the USB-C uh, standard power connector on the board, or if you put power in through the GPIO pins. And then when you go dig through the forums, you find people giving you all kinds of stupid ideas to do anything. But anyway, Bob had one of the things that came up was uh, Bob found an adapter on Adafruit. Say, oh, I'm going to get one of these, and like a week had gone by, and I was looking at it, and I realized, well, that's the wrong one. That's not a plug. That's a socket. So what you really want is a plug that you solder wires onto and plug into there. And then he found this one. It's it's just a cable that just has wires on the end of it. When you buy it, it just looks like that. And I'll before we're done here, I'll put that in the link to that in the chat. And so this way, if you put power in, on the connector there, you've got the red and the black wire is the power wires. And from various things, digging through all the posts, it looks like if you just put 5 volts into that connector, that the board will power up and run. And then you don't have all these weird things about it trying to inject power into various places where it shouldn't be. So that to me, it seems like that's the reasonable thing to do. If you can get a connector that will plug in to the standard power port on your board, you're probably gonna be better off. You got less chance of blowing everything up. So I decided to order one of those. And if I back up a moment here, I don't have a Raspberry Pi 5, but I have a Raspberry Pi 4, and it's got the same type of power connector, and it doesn't require as much current. The standard specs for the Pi 5 say you should have. They suggest you have a 5 amp power supply. I think the Pi 4 says they suggest you have a 3 amp power supply. So if you buy their official wall wart for the Raspberry Pi, it says it's rated at I think either 5 or 5.1 volts at 5 amps, and that it all works together and that keeps everybody happy. But you can't run it on batteries that way. That's why we're looking at going down this other path. And so anyway, when I noticed that adapter from Adafruit wasn't going to work, and then Bob popped up and said, "Oh, I found this one on Amazon, and it's for I think like $11. You get 2 of these cables, and they say they're like 1.2 meters long, and I'd probably cut it off at about 6 inches from the. So I'd probably cut mine off right about here, and hook it up to a power supply, so I don't have all the extra length on there to you know to drop the voltage on the thing. So anyway, I ordered that, and those showed up. And then the other thing, while I was looking at then they suggested, it says, oh, you might want to look at this board. It's a little power supply board that they claim it's um, uh, some about a PD charging adapter for a phone. And basically, you put on one end. Let's see, this end here, this is backwards. So on this end, this is the input power, and they give you a little a coaxial input jack, or they give you screw terminals, which I think are just in parallel. So you put in, I think it said 6 to 32 volts or something is what it will accept. Then the other end of the board has a USB connector, and another set of screw terminals. And again, I think those are in parallel. And on their little video on the web page, they show a cable plugged into the USB, and then they plugged it in their phone. And for what they were doing, that was working. And it also says cryptically on their web page, it says, here's a fast charging ID chip or something is what they called it. And if you look on the back of the board, there's 2 traces that go from here down to this USB connector. So possibly just plugging that together with the USB cable, that will keep the Raspberry Pi happy, Raspberry Pi 5 happy, and the 4 doesn't care. So, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the input power and run my battery power into that terminal strip, and then take the cable and just hook it up to this terminal strip. So I'll just take the, I keep losing it here. Just take the power wires from here and hook them up with that terminal strip, and nothing else, just to test it out and verify this is all going to work. And I think for the Pi 4, you don't have to do anything special. But then if you look at the Pi 5, there's several things around this power. They say that it's a PD compatible interface, and PD means power delivery. I think what it is. That's some new thing on USB where if you want, you can tell it, oh, give me 9 volts or 12 volts or something else instead of 5 volts. And that way you can buy the little, say like the USB charging batteries, and now those support that. So if you want, you can get 12 volts out of those, or you can get 9 volts or get 5 volts. I think all the way up to 20 volts you can get out of those. So on one hand, you got to be careful. You don't want to plug something in and give it have it supplying the wrong voltage and blow everything up. But they added that. That's apparently just the modern way to do things. So on the Raspberry Pi 5, they say, we recommend you have a 5 amp power supply. And if you got if you plug in their wall wart and power it up, it seems to understand, both the charging adapter and the board both understand what's there, and they talk back and forth. Kind of like the way the HP and the Dell laptops work, where you plug that into the charger into the wall, and then the computer and the charger talk back and forth to decide voltages and currents and all that kind of stuff. So it's the same concept. They just put that on the USB connectors now. So if you have the real charger and you plug it in and boot the thing up, one of the steps they have what they call power supply negotiation is on this new stuff. And somewhere along the line, the device, the Raspberry Pi, will go out and negotiate with the charger, and it says, how much current can you supply me? And I'm not sure how they communicate that, but that's one of the things it does. And it looks to see if it's got a 5 amp power supply. And digging through all the forum posts, it says if you have a Raspberry Pi and you try to power it up and you don't have the official supply, a message will show up in D message that says, I can't find a 5 amp supply, therefore I'm going to limit the output power on your USB connectors. And if you dig into that, it says instead of allowing 1.6 amps on your USB connectors, they're going to limit that down to 0.6 amps because they think you have a 3 amp supply, or they don't know, or whatever. So that's an issue right there. So if you don't have the official supply, you will get that message and D message saying, this is not going to work. So we're gonna help you out and make sure it doesn't run for you. So then you dig through some more stuff, and somebody says, well, if you go into the I think it's the /boot/config directory, there's a file in there, and it might just be called config.txt or something like that. But anyway, they say if you go in there and add a line that says USB max power enable equals 1, then they seem to think that when you boot up the computer, it will see that and get around the fact that it couldn't identify a 5 amp power supply. So what that means is if that does successfully work, and I haven't tried it because I don't have a Raspberry Pi 5, but if that works, then the thing will switch and it will allow 1.6 amps on your USB ports. Now, the other issue associated with that, if you don't have a 5 amp supply, it says if you're trying to boot through a USB port, and I don't know if that means boot from a flash drive or boot from a external solid state drive or whatever, it says, oh, a message pops up and says you cannot boot from the USB port because you do not have a 5 amp power supply. So that's the second problem you can run into. That number one, it's not going to supply the output current, and then number two, it says without that current capability, we're not going to let you boot from that. So I think putting that one message in that says, set max power to 1 just to enable that function, I think that bypasses all that junk, and then possibly that'll work. So that's something people are going to have to try that out and see if that will indeed work. And one other thing on that, if you dig through the Raspberry Pi 5 documentation, it says if you power it up and you don't have the official supply, you'll get that message and D message saying we don't understand, we're going to limit your power. But when it does that, it says the green light on the board starts blinking, and it'll blink for 30 seconds. And during that time, if you push the power button, it says, he wants us to bypass this, and it will then go ahead and let the board. I think it'll bypass all that stuff, and the board will run normally until the next time you turn it off, turn it back on. You'd have to do the same thing. So I think putting the stuff into that configuration file might get around that, and just you can just ignore the fact you don't have the standard power supply. Let's see, what was the other thing on that? And then they were talking about other people in the forums. Oh, maybe you can go into the EEPROM, and there's something about you'd put in something that says like USB power equals 5,000 or something like that. They weren't quite sure on the format of that, and I don't know if anybody actually got that to work. But so apparently there's this on, I think in the Pi 4 and the Pi 5, that they've now got an EEPROM on the board, and they load some kind of boot control code into that. And somehow you can go, I saw a little command line, you can go in and edit stuff in there. So if you knew the correct thing to put in there, that may also fix the problem, or maybe you need to do both of those things to keep it happy in the long run. So, but the real trick is, if you got a power supply, like say this one that I bought, and you got the cable like this, I think on mine with the Pi 4, if I just hook the things together and run it, I don't think it cares about anything else. I think that will keep my stuff happy. But on the Pi 5, then you might have to go into the configurations and tell it, no, I'm serious about this. I really do have a 5 amp power supply. So that might take care of that.
When you get a second, you had me run this command, and I posted what I got off of my machine. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Well, the reason I wanted you to try that is because this is something else that Bob found. He said he was looking for just a few messages up there. He said I was looking for he was curious how to monitor the voltages and the temperatures on his board, and he found this command that you can run. And if you run that command on the Raspberry Pi 5, yes, it comes up and shows you that there's like 12 different voltages and some like 10 or 12 different currents that it shows you. That's what all the stuff is telling you right here. And so just by typing in the command, it dumps all that stuff out, and you can see what's happening internally in the board. Now on the Pi 4, they don't have that command. You've got to, it's slightly different. You say, what is it, VC gen command, and then you say something like USB voltage or something like that, and it'll it gives you like one, or no, you say, you put in the command and say, I want to see the voltage, and it just gives you one single voltage, which I think is the processor core voltage of like 0.8 volts or something. So it's just amazing. It dumps out all this stuff that you can get to. And then right below that, I had if you put that back up.
Sure.
And then I said, here, go try this command, which you apparently didn't see that because I never heard back.
I didn't see it.
So right there, I said, here, try this. It says vcgen command, get config, USB max current enable. And I think if you run that, it's just going to come back and you're going to say equals 0 or equals 1. Now it's not clear to me if that's telling you whether you've put that command into your configuration file, or if it, because there's got to be some way, if you say go out and, when the thing boots up and it decides it has a 5 amp supply or not, there's got to be some kind of status that will tell you that. And that command that I ask you to type in probably, well, yeah, see what it does here.
Oh, I got to do sudo with this stuff for some reason.
So
can you see that?
Yes, I can. So are you running, you got the standard power supply on that?
This has yes, it's the Walmart with 5 amps.
Okay, so that's telling you that's apparently saying that it was happy when it booted up, it found the 5 amp supply that it wanted. Because I didn't know if it was telling you that, or it's telling you if you put that into your configuration file. And apparently that's saying yes, it found the one you wanted. So that was just one other thing that ties all this stuff together. So I'm guessing that if you put it, if you don't have the supply and you put that into your configuration file, put that thing that popped back up at the bottom where it said USB max power enable equals 1. It says if you put that in the configuration file, then it will go ahead. Then I think it'll go ahead and work. So that might answer the question on that, that if you get, you put 5 volts and enough power into that connector and you put that command in, I think that'll keep everybody happy.
Cool. Sorry for not seeing that earlier.
So once, yeah, it's one of those things where Slack, you don't know if it's going to notify you or not. And so that's kind of, that exhausts most of the stuff I was going to talk about for the Raspberry Pi power, Pi 5 power. So I was going to talk about the power supply, which I showed, the cable, and I said the config files there. I'll try to post some links. Yeah, I don't know if I'll put them in with a video or put them on Slack or wait till next week and then do this correctly. But eventually we'll put that up. And just the other thing I was going to mention was all the forum posts. There's lots of stuff. It turns out if you go look at the actual Raspberry Pi forums, those people seem more knowledgeable about what's going on. But you have to remember, they're going to be talking about the Raspberry Pi OS as opposed to Ubuntu OS. So that was one of the reasons why I said, here, go run those commands to see if those run under Ubuntu. And apparently it does work. That board you have, that is the one running Ubuntu.
Sorry about that. Yes, it's 2404.
Okay, so that shows that yes, that VC gen command, whatever that was called, that does work under Ubuntu, and I didn't know if it would. I didn't know if that was a specific to the Raspberry Pi OS. So that's good to see that does work. And the other thing I mentioned was the Pi 4 is much more trimmed down as far as how all that stuff works, which may or may not be a good thing to have, but good thing. It still works, and it just trying to report the voltages and currents, it has very little that you can do on the Pi 4. And anyway, back to the forum posts, you got to keep in mind, you read through those, they're usually talking about the Raspberry Pi OS as opposed to somebody else's OS. So that's something, they say to do this, and that may or may not work under Ubuntu then when you try that. But the people on the Raspberry Pi forum seem to be much more knowledgeable. You go out in the wild, like on Reddit or one of these kind of places, and you get all these really weird things. Oh, here, try this or do that, and without any regard to whether or not it makes sense or if they, actually know how it works or not. So for instance, one of the posts, somebody said, I want to do basically what we're talking about here. You want a power supply and a cable, and you wanted to plug that in. And our guy says, oh, well, here, just take your power and just put it into the USB 3.0 port on your board, which is normally that's supposed to be a host port, and that's what's supposed to put power out. But he says, oh, just hook the power up there because that's only got 2 power pins, and boy, that'll just work great. And then it turns out if you go look through the actual Raspberry Pi documentation page under USB, somewhere down there says, do not back drive your ports. That's stupid. It says if you do, you're bypassing all the safety measures or something that's in there. And I'm not sure that putting power on that is even going to power the board if you do that. So you got to be careful of that. People making these stupid statements without actually knowing what they're talking about. So you have to, it's best to find, several people that agree on this stuff. But the problem is if the second person read the first person's post, they may say the same thing. So again, you just have to, with any of this stuff on computers these days, you just have to, go down the line and try to find people that know what they're talking about, and you have to decide, do they really know what they're talking about or not? So I just wanted to comment on that. So I dug through a bunch of stuff, and that's kind of what I was seeing on all that stuff. So I'm going to say that pretty much sums up what I was talking about for the power stuff, and I should write up something better, and I'll have to decide what to do about that. So back to my story, I had this Raspberry Pi 4. Everybody's talking about their Pi 5s, and I had this Pi 4. It's been in a box for like 2 years because it's one of those things you buy the brand new board, and the operating system takes 2 to 6 months to catch up. And I'd loaded something on it and thought it was working, and then I just put it on the shelf. So I pulled that off the shelf and plugged it in. The first problem I had, I realized my HDMI adapter cable wasn't in there, so I had to order a new one of those on Amazon. But I hooked everything up and tried to power it up, and it wouldn't power up. It turns out the green light on the board was flashing 4 times, and it seemed to do that consistently. So I went and looked that up, and there are pages that say if your Raspberry Pi will not boot, here's what the LEDs, the flashing LEDs mean. And that I found a page that said something about and depending for each different type of board, they have different patterns or different things that they report. So somewhere it said, oh, for the Pi 4, make sure you read the section on Pi 4. And it said, oh, if your LED is blinking 4 times, that basically means the EEPROM loader could not find something .elf file, and therefore it thinks you've got a damaged file system. Either the code on the board is wrong, and in my case, it might be that I shouldn't have had that card plugged in the first place. I might have had the wrong thing there. So it said either your file system is corrupted, or you got the wrong one, or you've got your board is damaged and there's bad wiring between your USB connector. And I thought, well, not USB, the SD flash connector. And I thought, well, what I could do is I could just reload an operating system on that I know is the right one. And so the point was my Pi 4 would not boot up, and I decided I needed to do something with that flash card. So I took it to plug it in my other Linux computer, and the thing didn't want to recognize it. And I screwed around, and finally, with all my various adapters around, I found an adapter, and I plug it in. It still wouldn't recognize it, but I noticed after about 10 or 20 seconds, the light started flashing on it, and then it went ahead and mounted, and I could look at it. And it looks like it had just looking at, I think in log files is where I was looking, and it looked like it maybe had Ubuntu 1804 on it. And that, it's a fairly old operating system, and you got to make sure the operating system matches a board to see if it'll run it or not. And so I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and load the newer code on this thing. So go from it was like 1804. I was going to go up to either 2204 or 2404. And I went through this whole thing where you're looking at web pages and try to figure out what versions of ROS run with what versions of operating system, and find out if that operating system will run on your particular Raspberry Pi. And I finally found a page, I think it was on the Ubuntu download page for Raspberry Pi. I think it was saying for 2404, it will run on a Pi 4 and it will run on a Pi 5. So I thought, well, okay, if it'll run Ubuntu 2404 on my older Pi 4, then possibly, because it says then ROS2 Jazzy will run on 2404. So I haven't actually loaded that yet, but it looks like I can indeed get that to work. So the thing was, I screwed around and I downloaded the ISO image for 2404, and I had a flash card that's got 2204 on it. And one point when I couldn't get my cards to read, I booted my computer from that. So I went from 2004 to 2204 just by booting the external flash drive. And my problems with my flash cards did not go away. And I thought, well, maybe I guess a lot of this goes on to my next problem of my 32 gigabyte cards that won't talk, period. But anyway, the point is I got the ISO downloaded for 2404, and then I couldn't figure out how to write that out to my flash card. And I kept digging through my computer thinking, well, if I ran it, it's either got to be in my terminal, looking the history of how I did it, or I had to run a GUI based thing to do that. I couldn't find any record of that other than the file was on the computer that I'd used. So I finally found that if I run DD, and because I tried to load Balena Etcher, because they say, oh, go get this, and I look at the install files to load it, and they make no sense. Everybody says, oh, just do this, and I try that, and the options are not there. And finally I gave up on that. I couldn't get that to load and run. So I just used the DD command, and that was able to write 2404 out to my install drive. And I loaded that one up thinking that was going to solve my problems. So somewhere along the line, I thought I found some 32 gigabyte micro SD flash cards that I bought a couple of years ago. And I plugged those in, and the computer would not recognize those. So this is on my Ubuntu laptop. No matter what I did, I couldn't get those to be recognized, whether I was using like I had this adapter that's it's USB, and it's got the two little slots you can plug in either the big card or the little card into that. And so basically it looks like a USB device, and it recognizes this adapter, but it wouldn't recognize the card. And I got a smaller one here that was basically works the same way, but it's just a little plastic thing that plugs in plugs directly into a USB port, and there's a little slot in the end. You slide your card in there. And this one, I finally got that to work on with the old 16 gigabyte card that was from my Pi 4. That's how I knew what was on it and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, so somewhere along the line, I found those 32 gigabyte cards. I thought, well, I'll load those up. And I could not get the computer to recognize those no matter what I did. No, the other option I had was, my couple of my laptops, maybe all my laptops have a little slot. You can plug a full size SD flash card into it. And then so you get the one that's the adapter, and you put so you get the adapter and you put the little, slide the little card into it. I was going to bring one of those down and I don't have it here, but just the standard stuff like you do. So that was a different interface. That's an actual SD flash card interface. So neither that one nor the USB interface, neither one of those would recognize that card and mount the things. And I did a bunch more digging, and I found a web page that said, oh, by the way, these 32 gigabyte cards do not work. And I'll post that link if I think about it here. And they said, I looked into it, and it's something about the fact that it's a low voltage card. So somewhere in the manufacturing process or whatever, they've changed something. And it says, here, go look at this link. And you follow that. That goes to the kernel maintainers for Ubuntu. And they're saying, oh, yeah, we had this problem with these cards. And there's this big elaborate write up on what they found. And they changed some things. And they said, well, okay, we made this change and it seems to work. So here's a patch for it. And I didn't know what to do with the patch. So I just ignored that. But I could not get those cards to work on my Ubuntu computer, no matter what I did. And somewhere along the line, I thought, well, let me try it on my Windows computer, which is sitting right here. And they didn't mount and be recognized on that either. So it could be I've just got some bad cards or something else as funny is going on. So anyway, that's why I wanted to get the newer operating system. So that's why I loaded on my flash drive here. And I got 2404. I can plug that in and boot from that, and gives me the newest operating system. And it still doesn't understand those cards. So that's something else I ran into, and it was getting pretty late by that point. I went to bed at 7:30 in the morning after fighting with that all night. And then so I think that pretty much covers all the various things I was going to talk about here. And I'll try to write up some of this stuff a little more. I need to actually hook up the USB cable to this power supply and plug it into my Pi 4 and verify I can run that off a battery. And then somebody, when they get their parts, if they want to try that on a Pi 5, they can do it there and see if that does the same thing. And as I say, you might have to update your configuration file to get that, keep everybody happy on that. So back on the Pi 5, if you don't do the extra configuration, it's going to limit you to your USB ports will not put out as much power as you'd prefer. But I think everything will still run at that point. So that'd be interesting, somebody make notes on that as you go to see if that, what you have to do, and when you're all done, how does that actually work? So I think that's pretty much where I'm at. So I actually got something done this week, and that's I should have spent another day to document all this, so I could have just posted it right now, but there may be a delay here between when I get it. I might talk about on the meeting next week and say, and list all the spots and say, go look at these and read this first and whatever. So I think that's all I got to say.
Good deal. Along those same lines, I mean, if Bob or somebody else like him listens to this, I would start with booting from the SD card instead of trying to jump right to booting from the USB. And although it's possible, it's smaller steps I think is going to be good than taking a big jump, because I was trying to boot from USB and PCIe, and yeah, I got myself into trouble that way. But I think I feel your pain around some of those SD cards.
And also along the same comments, that if you're going to play with a brand new Raspberry Pi 5, go ahead and use the official Walmart and load up your software, play with it so it's all running. And then if you want to try running on batteries, then go down that path and try to do this extra modifications. So I think that, so yeah, just plug in an SD flash card with whatever operating system you want to run and verify Yeah, in fact, you're probably better off getting a flash card with their actual Raspberry Pi operating system and plug it in, verify the thing boots up, and get a feel for how the thing runs. And then once you do that, then you could, load up, say, Ubuntu on it and play with that. And then when you get everything up and running, so you're happy with it, then you could experiment with the power and replacing the wall wart with like an external power supply and doing that kind of stuff.
A couple of things for me to talk through. One of the things that I've been working on is trying to follow this guy's DIY radio transmitter, and that's a sort of a logical layout of the parts. And so I had followed his lead and created, well, I'll just show you a board, ordered it from PCBWay, it showed up, and I started putting components on it, and I knew that this was going to be a learning exercise for me, and it was. So it wasn't like I was expecting perfection in the first time, and I started putting parts on there. And make a long story short, I've got a second version of the board now, and some of the changes are flipping the potentiometer around so that physically this little, let me make that larger, little line on the diagram means that the pot is turned all the way to the left, which, depending on how you hook the wire up, it would be at a zero, I think a zero voltage at that point, which I know now because I had originally put it in with those pins on this side. And so that was sort of, it worked. But let's just say I would rather have the zero all the way to the left like that. Also on these LEDs, this is where some LEDs were going to be installed. And you can see this is, well, you might guess it's 2.54 millimeter spacing, because on the original board, the spacing that it put on the board actually was straight pins from this 5 millimeter LED, which, although I could make it work, well, not make it work, my soldering skills are such that I could about make that happen. But the holes, I just found that LED and put that LED component on the board, and it said, oh, well, for that component, you need this spacing. And I didn't think through the fact that I needed a little bit of space to solder that. So that's a learning that on the board, you can use the physical component, or you can use what you want for soldering, because although that is my soldering job there, it's still a little bit tight for me, and that's my soldering job as well. And although the LEDs weren't so bad, there was a couple of capacitors over here that got really small for my soldering skills. So I've gone back and made those a little bit bigger. And in this easy EDA software, you can actually adjust the pad properties, both the width of the pad and the height of the pad. And it gives you it gives you a lot of flexibility to adjust that. For me, I'm just finding it easier to go ahead and put, a 4-port board in there, and I label it an LED, and so I'll know that's where the LEDs go.
While you're on that picture right there, looking at your LEDs, why don't you zoom in on one of those a little bit? But yeah, it looks to me like those are going to be awfully close together. I ran the numbers. You've got 5 millimeter LEDs, and you got about a 2/10 of an inch spacing between those two. The LEDs are going to be touching each other, and
Mm,
you can just easily slide that down. Your previous board, your LEDs were spread out, so um,
that's
they
a good point.
weren't right on top of each other.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'll have to give that a little bit more spacing. I certainly have the real estate there to space those out a little bit. So,
You know, I think the other side you had room to do that also.
um,
And
yeah.
just a few comments on what you're doing here, since you're just learning PC board layout and all that kind of stuff. Number one, I tend to not run traces any closer to pads than I have to. Some places you got like I saw you had a trace that went like all around one pad, and depending on how good the solder mask is they give you, if it's perfect solder mask, you can get away with that. And then also, because when you do it, it doesn't care. It's going to run it's got to go from one side of the board to the other. It's going to run it right next to the any pads that it finds, because it doesn't care unless you tell it. Sometimes you've got to on maybe you have to have more, should we say, more professional packages, and you can actually specify, keep what you're doing routing, say don't get within a certain distance of a pad if you're not actually connected to it. So that's one thing. Um, I don't know if you got anything else.
Well, I can pull up the actual software because it might have some options that I've just not explored, because at the moment I just do auto route and it magically does its thing. I can't seem to, well, let me move this. Um, the, I'm assuming there is some sort of option around put so much spacing, but here's what I choose. I click on auto route and it gives me that, and I run it. Looks like there's something here. Track width, minimum clearance. Maybe I could increase that clearance.
Yeah, maybe the clearance is the one. If you play with that, just make it something bigger and run it. Just run it once and see what it
Yeah.
does, just to see what that does to it.
Anyway, back to your comments.
So
So now this is the actual source board.
so on your Teensy right there, I see it ran two traces between your pads. And see if
Two traces
yeah,
between
right
pads
there, right. I was gonna say right in your cursor. That's my cursor, I guess. But see, you
here.
got a switch on the left, and then you got like those three parallel traces, and two of them
Oh,
go
those
between those
two.
pads there. So you're getting even tighter. It's you have more chances it's going to screw up when you get your boards back.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is see if you can avoid this.
Yeah, there's just various things where the less, and see, then on the so on the left there where you've got the mode switch, you got three traces running in parallel on it. So it's trying to put all this stuff as close together as it can. Again, probably
Mm-hmm.
based on your space,
Clearance.
yeah, either clearance or your track spacing or whatever that's called.
Yeah, I did not knowingly tell it to do anything like this. I just clicked auto run or auto route, and it does all that magic.
As long as you're going to a decent quality manufacturer, they have various. Back in the old days, they'd use silk screen to put your solder mask on, and that wasn't really all that precise. And they came up with something new. It's like a photo, some kind of a photo process where you get nice crisp edges, and it goes exactly where you tell it. So, in reality, you're not going to have a lot of problems with that.
Anything
Uh,
else you noticed?
on that pot that you had right there, that was an example where it's got on the pins up there at the top. See, there you got those blue traces just kind of, trying to hug as close as it can to those pads. So again, once you do this, could you then hand edit and move those traces around?
I think you can, yeah. I mean, I can,
So that's what I typically do. Usually I just route all mine by hand when I do them, but uh that it certainly is much easier to just click on it and say, yeah, auto route that for me. And if you're happy with what it creates, then just go with that. So just those kind of things. Then the other thing you're going to find out as you go through this stuff that typically people make their power in the ground, make those bigger size traces. And I don't know if it gives you the option to do that on this thing or not, where you can say, anything named VCC or whatever that's called. You might be able to go and say set the width of those traces to one thing, and then set all your signal traces to something else. And you really
yeah.
don't want to have to go through and click on each one and modify it. If you can just in general say a net name of either VCC or whatever you called it. Say on the under that net list, you might be able to go in there right there and say um, whatever power it's called. It's probably called VCC, so it might be down at the bottom. No, I guess not. What you find, and their problem is that when people lay out their boards and you got stuff spread all over, it may say if you got 5 things that have to have power on them, it might start at one side and just make a single wire and just daisy chain that around. So everything's basically in series, and then but there's no reason why it can't come in and do more like say a star pattern where say it might go from the center one and then run a from each thing around it, might run the traces out to it. So as far as how you actually lay out, when you go to actually put the traces on the board, there's ways you can do it so you're gonna have less chance of it having power problems when you're done because of that. And apparently I assume have you powered it up and verified that you got everything soldered down, everything runs.
No, I didn't power it up because the capacitor pins were too tight and I didn't want to blow it up. So I've not done a function test on this at all. This is the new layout, by the way, with 2.5 millimeter separation on these capacitors.
Another thing you might want to do is these comments I'm making on how you lay out a board and how you do this. I'm sure there's lots of tutorials that go through and tell you this kind of stuff that give you pointers on do it this way or don't do it that way. And then what was their thing? And then back to the point, you might want to work on your soldering skills. And by looking at it, I'm guessing that number one, you're not getting your pad hot enough because if you have decent solder that's got decent flux in it and you get that pad hot and you put solder on it, it'll just flow around where it's supposed to go, as opposed to some of your soldering job look like you're doing more of a dabbing concept where you get it just hot enough to slap some solder on, then you pull your soldering iron away. And it's really a matter of just experience and practice to get these things to come out to be solderable.
No doubt I could have better soldering skills.
Are you using like the old lead-based solder, or did you get the new lead-free solder?
I think I have 60/40. I'd have to pull it out.
Well, that's the ratio of tin to lead, but then I guess if it's 60/40, that would be lead-based then probably, because the new stuff is like antimony or something like that. So I typically just use the old lead-based solder because if you get lead-based solder, you get something that got decent flux in it, it works out fairly well. And then you also might want to get I just saw it up here on the shelf. You can get extra flux. You can either get liquid-based flux that you can squirt on, or here's this is, I see this from Kester. This is It's the same kind of container like you do for plumbing solder.
Right.
Do not use flux for plumbing, because it's going to be corrosive and is going to over time destroy your board. So you want to get rosin flux, and if you open it, just just crap like that in it. So um, every once in a while, I'll take my solder and heat it up and get it so it flows and goes out nice. But see, it's growing crystals on it and do all kinds of funny things. This is like 20 years old. See, you don't use very much because that was, I bought that for like $7 or whatever it was. But you can take this and just smear it on the board. Um, and that makes your soldering easier if you got extra flux on there. What was there? Oh, and when you get those PC boards like that, before you start soldering it, take your board and lay it down so you got the side you're going to solder from. Get like the Scotch Brite pads, those little green things like you use to wash your dishes,
Mm-hmm.
and just rub across the board, and that'll scrape off any because there's probably a slight coating on all those pads to start with, that if you get it hot enough, you play around enough, it burns it off and goes ahead and solders. But if you do that, so it kind of roughs them up and then gives you a little, just gets the extra crap off from there. So that's another thing that might help you out too, if you think about that when you get ready to do it.
Thanks for that.
And again, there's probably soldering tutorials where they tell you all these kind of things that.
Let's see. The only other thing that I think I was going to mention, come on, get that to work. Close that thread. So in my new setup, my board, the electronics board that would be on the tractor is where I have, an RPi 5 running ROS and doing some of the major communication, but then having a Teensy 4.1 connected to some other components. As example, a power control for the steering motor. And because of that, I don't want to take this Teensy on and off. I want to be able to program it through, this Raspberry Pi. And in my experience, I've done it one of two ways, using the Arduino IDE or using a combination of Platform IO installed inside of VS Code. And so I had worked through how to, on an RPi 5, to get that Arduino IDE loaded up, and then putting in this thing called Teensy Arduino. And so that was a little bit of not a little bit, that first I installed Arduino through the App Center. Don't do that because that uses Snap. And when you try to put Teensy, maybe it's physically possible. It might not be breaking any laws of physics, but I couldn't figure out how to get this installed with Arduino 2 installed via the App Center. So I went back to manually installing Arduino 1.8 and then manually downloading and installing Teensy Arduino. And these are the commands that I use. And you've also got to set some permissions via a UDEV rule in order to get all that to work. I also do have it running now on VS Code and Platform IO, which is actually not tough at all. So I've got two different ways to program that Teensy when I come to that. And I happen to remote into my RPi through a platform called No Machine, which has been continues to work really well for me. And I've got zero tier VPN installed as well, so that I can do that sort of I don't have to be on the local network. two machines don't have to be on the local network. I can like have a Windows 10 machine. Jeff could program my Teensy if I hooked him up with the zero tier VPN. So that's all working pretty well for me. Next step for me is the picture that I showed for a motor controller was I forget the brand name, but this is the IBT-2 motor controller that'll handle 30 amps. And I was thinking about switching to this motor controller. And so I was just going to do some desk checks with that and just one of these 775 motors just to physically get the Teensy to drive this and drive the motor and see how I adjust the power on this. If I really want to get fancy, I would hook up some sort of rotation sensor to this and see if I can get a PID to work all on the desk, but we'll see how ambitious I get around that. So that's where I'm at the moment. And I think that's it for recording.
I was trying to think there's something else I was going to mention there and I forgot what it was now. Oh, do you don't happen to have a Pi 4 laying around you?
I do.
Do you have the official wall wart for that?
I don't. I think I just I always plugged it into something that always gave me a power warning because it would I get a lightning bolt flashing when it would start to boot up.
No. My point was, if you had the official wall wart for the Pi 4, you can plug that in Pi 5, which will not give you the 5 amp requirement, and then you can see the messages come up and say, look at D messages, oh, you don't have the correct thing, and that way you can experiment with that and try it. But if you don't have it, then that's not.
I probably have something that'll trigger a warning on an RPi 5.
Well, I'm guessing anything that's not the official thing is going to tell you, going to give you your warnings and cause that stuff. So, but I just thought if you had that one, it should plug right in, and then you could just fake it out real quick and say, oh, gee, that's the way it works. So, did I mention the schematics? I don't know if I mentioned that. It turns out if you go out on the official, I don't know if it's the Raspberry Pi 5 documentation or just Raspberry Pi documentation. It might be all of the documentation. There's a section there that says mechanical something and schematics. And it turns out they have partial schematics for some of their boards. And it looks like everything up to up through a Pi 4, they have some kind of partial schematics they post, but they don't have anything for the Pi 5 yet. And the other thing I noticed was I was mentioning that the Pi 4 came out and then they changed the version, and you go look at the schematics and it says, well, here's the schematic, which I'm guessing is the original stuff because it doesn't show anything special on there, that the whole power sensing stuff. And they don't mention, even on the page there, it doesn't say this is for a certain version of board, but that stuff is available, so you can get some idea what some of the stuff's going on. But they don't even put the USB ports on there, so you don't know how those are powered and how they control those. And they don't show they might just give little bits and pieces of the processor, so you know where the power hooks up to it. But they purposely limited it so you can't reproduce a Raspberry Pi, I think, is probably why they don't show everything. But
Yeah,
then
they
it makes
don't want it cloned in China.
Yeah, and they just it gets annoying because then you want to know, well, how did they do this, and you can't find out. So, but it's better than just looking at the board and say, well, I have no idea what they're doing on here. So it's kind of like this board that I just bought that, it's got all kinds of stuff on there, and if you really want to know, you'd have to trace that out and find out. I say there's what looks like 2 MOSFETs and a giant inductor, and there's really not a whole lot on this board. So if you really wanted to trace it out, you could, I suppose. But I was going to get something and try to figure out to see if I can get any indication with that. It says they said it's a charging ID connector or charging ID chip. And I probably, if I get close enough to read that, that's the one that's over that little chip right there is like a 6-pin chip. And I think if you get close enough to read it, it's just going to have some weird numbers on that aren't going to tell you anything anyway. As the chips get smaller, they put less text on them, so you have to go look it up somehow. So it'd be nice to know what that is to try to get an idea of how this actually works. But
You're right.
and it's just another one of those things that is, this stuff gets more modern. You don't have mounting holes, and so again, I don't know if we mentioned this before after we started recording, but for this one, I'd probably just get some double back foam tape and put on the back of this and stick it to something, and then it put a tie wrap around, drill 2 holes in the board, put a tie wrap, because the tape will hold it as long as it doesn't wiggle around. So you put the tie wrap in to hold it down. So that would be one way to mount that. So and then of course there's no documentation on anything that you buy anymore. You're buying it from China, and you're lucky that you're lucky if there's silk screen on the board that says in and out. On the back of this one, I see it does say at one end it says 5 volts in ground, and then at the other end says VN plus and VN minus, I think is what it says.
Ink costs money, Jeff.
Well, that's not the issue. It's just the fact that they don't bother to do it, because you got lots of room on here. No, actually, when you get the silk screen on, it's whether you put on nothing or you put on tons of stuff, they charge the same amount for it. So that can't be their excuse.
Their manufacturing cost is less if they can buy a 1-gallon can of ink versus a 5-gallon can of ink.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know if these were silk screened on or how they did that, but anyway, it's just more complaints that as things get more modern, they get smaller, they get less documented, so you have no idea how it actually works, and you're pretty much on your own. Kind of like the guy says, "Oh, put power into this USB port that you shouldn't be putting power into." It's kind of along those lines.
On a device like this with a screw terminal, what's been your experience at those staying tight over time?
Well, I got those crimp on ferrules that I was talking about one time, and those seem to you put it on the end of your wire and crimp it on there, and then it gives you like a metal thing that goes in there. And I found those work better, because I don't like putting wires into the screw terminals and tighten them down, because they always seem to fall out, as you're just alluding to. So, but I found,
you're saying the screw stays tight, but the wire works itself out, and those ferrules help with that. Is that what you're saying?
that's basically what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think if you go to our index, go down to the bottom of the screen there and say, pull up our HTML index for the meeting and search for ferrule, I think that'll have the video where I was talking about using those. And it's just something I bought a kit on Amazon where it's got, like
Different
6
sizes.
different sizes and a whole bunch of them in there. And they give you a crimper with it too. So you just buy that and put them on.
And for the index, how do you spell ferrule? Is it EFERREO?
I would just do FERR and see what shows up on that. Nice. Or maybe search for crimp, because I think I was calling crimp on ferrules. And I probably went through and said, maybe a couple of different times we were talking about that. And even going back to the ROS agriculture days, one of the guys, I think it was one of the ROSs, or I don't remember which one it was, but he said he uses those all the time. And I think Kyler said he uses those too. So even back then there was, some discussion on that, which is why I went out and bought them in the first place.
Nice.
That kind of stuff. Trying to think if I had anything handy here where I've got them. Probably if I've got some of my giant RC servos on the floor here, I'd probably put some on there. But it's, I'm not sure it'd be real beneficial to look at them right now. So, but you just go out on Amazon and just buy a kit with that kind of stuff. So, and then you can buy, if you decide you're using a lot of one size, then you just go out and you can buy a package of 100 or 500 of just whatever size you want, just to keep the box full. So that's another thing to think about on that.
And by the way, it was 2003 when a guy who worked in a factory that made radios, and his job was soldering. He said, heat up your soldering iron, put it on the pad, count to 1001, then put your solder on, count to 1002, take your solder off, count to 1003, let your solder float, take your iron off. That was his protocol. That's the only instructions I've ever had besides experience.
I never count, but if you put your tip on the pad, put it on the pad to have it touching your pin at the same time if possible, and let it sit there a little bit, and then stick your solder on. To solder immediately melts and starts flowing, then that's working well. And again, it's just a matter of playing. I think from board to board or soldering iron to soldering iron, it can work a little bit different too. So, but that's one of the tricks. You want to get the pad hot, and then stick your solder in, and the solder should melt, and then go where it's supposed to. And
Brings
if you
back
look at
old memories.
if you look at boards that I won't be able to show this because of course it's too small and won't focus. But like when they do where they use the new stuff, they use infrared heating or something.
Oh, do
But
they?
you look at these, and these all look, they get hot, and the solder flowed where it's supposed to. And so I'm looking at this big this connector here, that's that coaxial power connector. But the first thing I did when I got this board, I pulled out a magnifying glass and looked at the thing, and it looks like all the soldering was fairly decent on the board. And what's the other thing I did? Oh, I look for missing parts or whatever. Sometimes you look at it and a resistor might be missing. Of course, you don't know if it's missing or they didn't intend to put it on. That's another problem you can have. So anyway, I just looked it over when I got that. That seems like that kind of stuff.
Brings back my ham radio days. The guy who taught me was in the ham radio club.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it for me.
Okay, I guess I'm done too.